Students, welcome to the Chapter 2 lecture, which will be on jurisdiction. There are not going to be as many slides as our previous lecture having to deal with federal jurisdiction. One of the reasons why is a subject that we are covering. However, I'm not going to be as detailed. You could do the reading or look at the other PowerPoint. So I'm going to discuss jurisdiction as it applies to federal versus state, and also as far as it applies to with reservations dealing with Native Americans. With that being said, I know in the book it does talk about military law, and I'll leave you at your own leisure to go over that, but I'm going to focus on federal and state jurisdiction, with the last part talking about with the Indian jurisdiction. All right, let's move on to our first slide with federal jurisdiction. There we go. All right, so jurisdiction of the federal government to enact criminal laws. The federal government does not have inherent power, police power, that they can govern, that they are over every single crime that occurs in the United States. They are over certain enumerated laws that they can actually prosecute as a federal government than as a state government. And just so we understand, when we're speaking about the federal government and federal agencies, we're talking about agencies such as the FBI, ATF, Border Patrol, agencies of that nature. Whereas when we're talking about state and local governments, we're talking about our local police departments, California Highway Patrol, Sheriff's Department, and the crimes that they have actual jurisdiction over, as well as in the court system. You're going to have the District Attorney's Office here in the County of San Diego that's going to prosecute state crimes, and then the U.S. Attorney's Office, which will prosecute federal crimes. And that's the distinction between state and federal government. So the federal government just can't use its police power over every single law that happens in the United States, because many of those laws are protected by state governments. Move on to the next slide. So it states here on this PowerPoint slide, an activity that is solely within a single state, e.g. local state schoolyards, can be regulated by states and local communities, but not by the federal government. What that means is this, that most crimes that occur within the state, such as, let's say, murder, rape, things of that nature, child molest, I'm thinking of the real serious crimes, but petty theft, burglary, robbery, most of those are done in local communities, so those would be prosecuted by the state governments. Classified under federal jurisdiction or federal crimes, there are direct activities against the federal government or agencies. Examples: fraud on U.S. mail, bank robbery of a federal bank, violation of federal income tax laws, offenses by or against federal officers, crimes beyond jurisdiction of any state or between states. So hopefully by this slide you get an understanding of the difference between state and federal jurisdiction. So for the federal government, if there's a crime committed on a federal land, then that could be a federal crime, and therefore prosecuted by a federal agency and the U.S. Attorney's Office. In the next slide, we'll talk about the crimes that occur on banks and why those will be prosecuted by the federal government. Crimes that affect interstate or international travel or communication will definitely be done by the federal government. Crimes committed in places beyond the jurisdiction of any state. This includes the District of Columbia, because it is not a state. Actually, those crimes that are committed in the District of Columbia will be prosecuted in federal court. Crimes that interfere with activities of the federal government, such as federally insured savings and loan associations, violation of the federal income tax laws, and attempts to overthrow the U.S. government, that would fall under the federal government. When I mentioned in the previous slide, many people do not understand that when a bank robbery occurs at any local bank, the reason why the FBI or another federal agency would get involved is the fact that banks are federally insured, or I should say they're insured by the federal government. Therefore, if someone commits a bank robbery, that's going to be more than likely prosecuted by the federal government. But there are times when the federal government could say, you know what, we don't want to touch this one because maybe the amount that was taken wasn't that much, and they may say, you know what, we're going to leave it to the state agency to take over, and the states actually could prosecute those crimes, but majority of the times they're going to be prosecuted by the federal government. Federal jurisdiction over murder. So very rare is there a federal crime of murder, because most of the crimes that are occurred are state crimes and prosecuted by the local state agencies, usually a district attorney's office. It says, but however, within the special maritime and territorial jurisdiction, when death results from terrorism, as we discussed earlier, victim is a high-ranking U.S. government official. So if you shoot a congressman, that's going to be prosecuted by the federal government. When the victim is engaged in performing federal functions, when death occurs in connection with any federal crime, when the homicide occurs during an offense defined by Civil Rights Act of 1968, and when American citizens is killed anywhere in the world under the Comprehensive Crime Control Act. What you just need to know, and this is important, is that when it comes to prosecuting homicide, most of the cases are done by state governments as far as states' prosecutorial agencies. Very few of these crimes, as you can tell, are going to happen under the federal statute. Does it happen? Yes, it does, but most of them are done on the state level. Extradition, just going to point to this very briefly, is the removal of a person from one jurisdiction to another so that he or she can face charges in requesting jurisdiction. International extradition involves treaties between the U.S. and certain foreign countries where they will have to extradite the fugitives. And you can read more in the book about which extradition is permitted, which is not permitted. What I want to discuss and what happens to me in court is when we see somebody who commits a crime, let's say in San Diego, but then moves to a different state, and then we pick them up in the state, and then we're going to extradite that person back to San Diego to face their crimes. Or in the case of where someone has committed a crime in Texas, what normally happens is that someone happens, they're stopped here, they see there's a warrant for their arrest in Texas, and then we pick them up in San Diego, and then we're going to extradite them back to their state if the state so desires. Now, if it's a small crime, they may say, no, we don't want to even have the expense of having to send them back to our state. Finally, I'm going to go briefly over Indian tribes within the United States, because that's a separate jurisdiction. What you need to know is that most crimes, if they're over a year, which are more serious crimes, they will be prosecuted in the regular state agency, such as a district attorney's office. But here it says that if there are misdemeanor crimes, some misdemeanor crimes, they can actually be dealt with on the tribal lands of the Native Americans. Most of the times, I don't see too many of these cases, but for the more serious crimes, they will be prosecuted in state court. So that will conclude our lecture on jurisdiction. I hope everyone enjoys this week, and good luck on your exam. Take care.